5 men followed Alfred Packer into the frozen hell of the Rockies, looking for gold. But when the rations ran out, they didn't find fortune, they became the menu. Packer didn't just survive the winter, he came back heavier, richer, and carrying the wallets of the men he had just digested. This isn't a story of heroic survival. It's a practical guide on how to turn your best friends into calories when the world goes cold. The history of the human species is not a gilded chronicle of intellectual ascension or moral triumph. It is, at its fundamental core, a wet, visceral registry of food chains, a ledger where the survival of one organism is predicated entirely upon the mechanical dismantling and digestion of another. We clothe this reality in the silk of philosophy and the cotton of religion, but strip away the textiles, and you find a mouth and an anus. In the case of Alfred Packer, this metaphor sheds its figurative skin and reveals itself as a greasy, undeniable fact. We are not discussing the metaphorical consumption of resources here, but the literal chewing of fibrous tissue. This is the story of a biological imperative stripping away the pretenses of the Victorian era. Picture the arrival, not of a hero, but of a biological anomaly. A man emerges from a landscape that usually spits out frozen husks or bleached bones. The San Juan Mountains in winter are not a scenic backdrop, they are a thermodynamic weapon designed to extract heat from living bodies until the heart stops beating. Yet, here comes Alfred Packer, walking into the Los Pinos Indian Agency in the spring of 1874. He does not stumble. He does not crawl. His skin is not the translucent parchment of the starved, stretched tight over a skull grinning in anticipation of death. His face is flush with the rosy hue of health. His belly presses firmly against his waistband. He looks like a satisfied tomcat that has just licked the last trace of cream from a saucer, while the rest of his litter froze in the barn. This image is repulsive precisely because it violates the laws of narrative and physiology. We expect the survivor to be a martyr, a stick figure of suffering who crawled through hell on his hands and knees. Packer looked like he had spent the winter in a well-stocked larder. In his pockets, jingling with the obscene cheerfulness of stolen coin, were the wallets of 5 other men. He possessed their money, their personal effects, and, in a very literal sense, he possessed their calories. He had absorbed their mass. He was a walking graveyard, a singular vessel containing the wasted potential of 5 distinct human lives. He asked for whiskey, not water, and the smell radiating from him was not the scent of death, but the stale, copper odor of dried blood and the sweat of a man who has eaten too much meat. Let us rewind the biological clock to the 9th of February, 1874. This is the date the experiment began. 6 men stood on the precipice of a decision that would strip them of their humanity. They were leaving the encampment of Chief Ouray, a Ute leader who watched them with the weary eyes of someone who understands the indifference of the geography better than any white interloper. Ouray saw them not as pioneers, but as soft, leaking bags of water and protein about to step into a cryogenic chamber. He warned them. He told them the mountains were impassable, that the snow was a white shroud waiting to be dropped. But the white man's arrogance is a potent drug, blinding him to the reality that nature is not a resource to be tamed, but an executioner waiting for a mistake. The group consisted of 5 units of human resource and 1 guide who was defective by design. Shannon Bell, James Humphrey, Frank Miller, George Noon, and Israel Swan. Memorize these names, for in the eyes of history, they are no longer men. They are items on a menu. They were the flotsam of the industrial age, drifting westward on the currents of economic desperation. They were saddle tramps, failed farmers, and drifters, men whose value to the macroeconomy of the United States was negligible. They were the kind of men who believed the lies of the gold rush, a mass psychosis that convinced clerks and laborers that geology owed them a living. They looked at the mountains and saw bank accounts, the mountains looked at them and saw fertilizer. Leading them was Alfred Packer, a man whose qualifications were as fictitious as the maps he claimed to memorize. He was a grifter, a pathological liar, and an epileptic, a man whose brain misfired as often as his moral compass. He sold them the illusion of competence. He promised them a route to the gold fields of Breckenridge, a path through the snow-choked passes that did not exist. Why did they follow him? Because hope is a parasite that burrows into the frontal lobe, eating away at logic until only the hallucination of wealth remains. They packed their meager supplies, unaware that they were carrying just enough fuel to walk them to their own slaughter. The dynamic of the group was already fracturing before they left the site of the teepees. The West was not settled by the noble archetypes you see in statues, it was settled by the desperate and the deluded. These 6 men were a microcosm of that failure. They trudged into the tree-line, their boots crunching on the crust of the snow, moving away from the warmth of the fires and into the silence. Silence in the high country is not peaceful, it is heavy. It presses against the eardrums. It is the sound of an environment that lacks the capacity for empathy. As they ascended, the temperature dropped, and the air grew thin, starving their brains of oxygen, making them docile and confused, ripe for the events that would follow. Civilization is a fragile virus. It thrives only in the petri dish of temperate climates and abundant agriculture. Take a man out of the city, strip him of the police force, the church, and the grocery store, and place him in a caloric vacuum. Watch how quickly the infection of civility dies. It does not take years. It takes days. The code of law, the 10 commandments, the social contract, these are just stories we tell ourselves when our bellies are full. When the stomach begins to digest its own lining, when the body starts to cannibalize muscle tissue for energy, these stories evaporate. The primate brain takes over. It assesses the herd not for companionship, but for weakness. The expedition into the San Juan Mountains was a march into the throat of the beast. The snow fell with a relentless, mechanical persistence, erasing landmarks and burying hope. Provisions, calculated by incompetent men, began to dwindle. The salted pork ran out. The flour was dusted from the bottom of the sacks. The coffee, that black liquor of civilization, was gone. Hunger began to change the architecture of their faces. Cheeks hollowed, eyes sank into dark orbits, and teeth appeared larger, more predatory. They began to look at each other differently. A companion's thigh was no longer a limb used for walking, it was a roast. A bicep was no longer an arm, it was a steak. Packer, the guide, the men responsible for their safety, watched this transformation with a different kind of eye. While the others weakened, consumed by the cold and the fear, Packer observed. He was a man devoid of the burden of empathy, a sociopath perfectly adapted for a world where only the ruthless respire. He saw the inevitable conclusion of their journey long before the others did. He understood that the mathematics of survival were simple subtraction. 6 mouths were too many. 1 mouth, however, could survive indefinitely if the other 5 became the supply. This was not a tragedy, it was a biological experiment conducted in the thin air of the Rockies. The variable was morality. The constant was hunger. The hypothesis was that a man would rather chew on the leather of his own moccasins than consume the flesh of his brother. The experiment failed. Or, perhaps, from the perspective of Alfred Packer, it was a resounding success. He proved that the taboos of society are soluble in gastric acid. As the group vanished into the white blinding storm, they ceased to be a society of men and became a closed ecosystem, a grim loop where the only way out was through the digestive tract of the strongest, or perhaps the most treacherous, among them. The stage was set not for a heroic struggle against the elements, but for a butchery. The mountains closed behind them like the teeth of a trap. The wind howled, drowning out any prayers they might have offered to a god who had clearly forsaken this latitude. They walked into the white void, 5 walking carcasses and 1 butcher waiting for the signal to begin his work. The cold was absolute. The hunger was a sharp knife in the gut. And Alfred Packer, the Colorado cannibal, was just beginning to feel his appetite return. The gold rush was not an era of adventure, it was a widespread neurological infection, a virus that aggressively attacked the frontal lobes of the human brain. It bypassed the centers of logic and self-preservation, lodging itself deep in the limbic system where greed and delusion fester. It persuaded clerks, farmers, and the perpetual failures of the East Coast that the geological strata of the American West owed them a debt. It whispered that fortune was not a matter of labor or chance, but a divine right waiting to be claimed with a pickaxe. This fever turned rational men into gamblers, and gamblers into corpses. The group that entrusted their lives to Alfred Packer was infected with this very contagion, their judgment clouded by the hallucination of yellow metal, blinding them to the lethal reality of the topography they were about to enter. These 5 men were not heroes of an epic, they were units of human resource, interchangeable parts in the grinding machinery of the 19th century expansion. Shannon Bell, James Humphrey, Frank Miller, George Noon, and Israel Swan. To the historian, these names are etched in infamy, but to the economy of 1874, they were statistical noise. The panic of 1873 had shattered the markets, leaving the streets of the cities filled with the desperate and the unemployed. These men were the runoff, the debris flushed out of the system, drifting westward in search of a purpose that the civilized world could no longer provide. They were the biological refuse of the industrial age, willing to wager their metabolic existence against the thermodynamics of a Colorado winter. Israel Swan was the oldest of the herd, a man whose expiration date had arguably already passed. In a civilized society, he would have been tending a garden or sitting by a hearth, but here, he was a liability wrapped in wool. His body was a depreciating asset, his joints stiff with age, his reserves of fat insufficient for the caloric demands of high-altitude trekking. He was the first domino set up to fall, the weakest link in a chain that was already forged from brittle iron. Swan believed that gold would buy him a second youth or at least a comfortable end, unaware that his only contribution to the expedition would be the protein stored in his aging muscle fibers. Shannon Bell stood in stark contrast, a specimen of raw, unrefined aggression. If Swan was the dying past, Bell was the volatile present. He possessed a wiry strength and a temperament that soured quickly under pressure. In the taxonomy of the frontier, Bell was a predator who had not yet realized he was prey. He looked at the mountains with a challenge in his eyes, mistaking the indifference of nature for an adversary he could intimidate. He was the kind of man who believed that sheer force of will could alter the weather, a delusion that the San Juan Mountains would dismantle with freezing efficiency. He was not a leader, but he was dangerous, a coiled spring waiting for the tension of hunger to snap the mechanism. Frank Miller was the quintessential laborer, a man defined by the thickness of his calluses and the emptiness of his imagination. He followed orders because thinking required an caloric expenditure he was unwilling to make. He was the draft horse of the group, sturdy and plodding, designed for carrying heavy loads but utterly incapable of navigating the complexities of survival. Miller trusted the hierarchy. He believed that because Packer called himself a guide, Packer possessed the knowledge to lead. This blind faith in titles was Miller's fatal flaw, a distinct inability to see that incompetence often dresses itself in the loudest clothing. George Noon was young, perhaps too young to understand the permanence of death. He was driven by the naivety that plagues the youth of every generation, the belief that he was the protagonist of his own story and therefore immune to the tragic endings that befell others. He saw the expedition as a rite of passage, a romantic interlude before settling down to a life of wealth. The wilderness, however, does not recognize the concept of a protagonist. To the wind and the snow, George Noon was simply 70 kilograms of carbon and water, indistinguishable from a deer or a rabbit, and equally subject to the laws of freezing and starvation. James Humphrey remained an enigma, a shadow trailing the group. He was the silent observer, the man who nods and follows, his motivations buried under layers of taciturn stoicism. He represented the silent majority of the frontier, the thousands of nameless faces who walked into the void and never walked out. Humphrey was the ballast, the weight that kept the group tethered to their collective doom. He did not question the route, he did not challenge the leader. He simply walked, placing one foot in front of the other, marching toward his own butchery with the passive acceptance of cattle entering a chute. And then there was Alfred Packer, the architect of this disaster. He was a biological glitch, a man whose wiring was fundamentally crossed. Packer suffered from epilepsy, a condition that the 19th century viewed with suspicion and fear, but his true pathology was his chronic dishonesty. He was a fabricator of reality, a man who had told so many lies about his experience that he had likely begun to believe them himself. He presented himself as a seasoned mountain man, a master of the high passes, yet his skills were comparable to those of a blind mole. He did not know the way to the gold fields. He barely knew which way was north. Packer sold the group an illusion of competence. He spoke with the unearned confidence of a sociopath, painting pictures of easy trails and abundant game. He was a parasite looking for a host, and in these 5 desperate men, he found a vehicle to carry him through the winter. He did not see them as charges to be protected, he saw them as a buffer against the elements, a source of supplies, and ultimately, a source of sustenance. His survival instinct was detached from morality, it was a pure, reptilian drive that viewed other human beings as tools to be used and discarded. The stage for their departure was the encampment of Chief Ouray, a leader of the Ute people who possessed a wisdom carved from centuries of ancestral survival. Ouray watched the white men with a gaze that stripped away their pretenses. He did not see pioneers, he saw children playing with fire. The Utes understood the mountains not as a map to be conquered, but as a living entity that demanded respect. They knew that the winter snows in the San Juans were a white shroud that suffocated life. Ouray looked at Packer's ragtag group and saw the mark of death on their foreheads. The interaction between Ouray and Packer was a collision of two worlds. The indigenous world, rooted in the harsh realities of the ecosystem, and the colonial world, rooted in arrogance and abstraction. Ouray warned them explicitly. He told them that the passes were blocked, that the game had migrated to lower elevations, and that the snow was deep enough to swallow a horse. He offered them sanctuary, food, and safety until the spring thaw. It was an act of grace offered to invaders, a gesture of humanity that transcended the racial animosity of the era. But the virus of the gold rush renders its victims deaf to reason. Packer and his 5 disciples listened to the chief's words and heard only the delay of their fortunes. They interpreted Ouray's caution as jealousy, or perhaps primitive superstition. They believed they knew better. After all, they were men of the civilized world, armed with rifles and maps. Surely they could outsmart the weather. They looked at the warm fires of the Ute camp, smelled the roasting meat, and chose to turn their backs on it. They preferred the fantasy of gold to the reality of survival. The morning they left the agency was deceptive, as the mountains often are. The air was crisp, the sky a piercing, innocent blue that belied the violence of the coming storms. They loaded their meager supplies onto their backs, a pathetic inventory for the task ahead. They carried flour, a little bacon, some coffee, and insufficient blankets. Their clothing was laughable, cheap wool trousers, cotton shirts, and leather boots that would freeze into iron blocks the moment the temperature dropped. They did not have snowshoes. They did not have heavy furs. They were dressed for a late autumn stroll, not a siege against the Arctic conditions of the high Rockies. As they marched away from the safety of the valley, the sounds of the Ute camp faded, the barking of dogs, the laughter of children, the rhythmic chopping of wood. These were the sounds of life, of a community that knew how to exist in harmony with the land. Step by step, these sounds were replaced by the silence of the wilderness. It was a silence that felt heavy, a vacuum waiting to be filled by the sound of the wind. The snow crunched under their boots, a dry, sharp sound that signaled the drop in humidity. They were crossing a threshold, leaving the realm of biology and entering the realm of geology. Chief Ouray watched them go, standing motionless by his lodge. He did not wave. He did not call out a final farewell. He watched them with the dispassionate eye of a butcher watching livestock trigger the gate to the killing floor. He knew the mathematics of the winter. He knew how many calories a body burns shivering in a snowbank, and he knew how few calories were in the sacks they carried. He was not cruel, he was simply a realist. He knew that the mountains did not care about the dreams of white men. To the mountains, these 6 figures were just organic matter to be frozen, broken, and eventually, recycled. The group moved in a single file, a jagged scar against the pristine white of the snow. Packer took the lead, his posture feigning assurance, while behind him, the 5 units of human resource trudged in silence. The excitement of the departure began to wane within the first hour as the incline steepened and the air thinned. Their breath plumed before them in ragged clouds, the only evidence of heat in a landscape of absolute zero. They were walking into a trap of their own making, driven by greed, led by a liar, and doomed by their own monumental stupidity. By the time the sun began to dip behind the peaks, casting long, purple shadows across the snow, the reality of their situation began to set in. The temperature plummeted with the speed of a falling stone. The cold was not just a sensation, it was an aggressive force, probing for gaps in their clothing, stinging their skin, and stiffening their muscles. The gold they sought was buried under tons of rock and ice, miles away, but the death they had courted was right there, walking beside them, patient and inevitable. They had brought their wallets, their hopes, and their appetites, but they had forgotten to bring their humility. And on the Wild West, humility is the only currency the mountains accept. The snow in the Colorado high country is not the benign, fluffy blanket depicted in holiday greeting cards or the romanticized literature of the East Coast. It is an industrial abrasive, a granular substance that scours the will from a man as effectively as sandpaper removes varnish from rough wood. In the San Juan Mountains, the snow does not simply fall, it accumulates with the weight of a geologic sentence, sealing the passes and burying the valleys under feet of suffocating white powder. For the Packer party, the landscape ceased to be a navigational challenge and transformed into a prison cell with walls of ice and a ceiling of leaden, indifferent gray. The beauty of the peaks, once a source of awe, became a mockery, a pristine backdrop for a dirty, slow-motion execution. The transition from an expedition to a death march was not marked by a singular dramatic event, but by the quiet, terrifying math of subtraction. The provisions, which had been laughably inadequate from the start, vanished with alarming speed. The cornmeal was dusted from the corners of the sacks, the bacon was reduced to a memory of grease on a fingertip, and the coffee grounds were boiled until the water remained clear. When the last calorie of legitimate food was consumed, the group did not immediately die, they simply entered a new biological phase. They became engines running on fumes, their bodies turning inward to consume their own reserves, a process of self-cannibalization that begins long before the first knife is drawn against a companion. Hunger is not merely a sensation of emptiness in the stomach, it is a systemic chemical reaction that dissolves the glue holding civilization together. It begins with the burning of fat, but when that is gone, the body attacks the muscles, the organs, and finally, the brain itself. As the glucose levels in their blood plummeted, the men of the Packer Party lost the ability to process complex thought. Altruism, patience, and camaraderie are expensive neurological functions requiring energy they no longer possessed. They became irritable, paranoid, and profoundly selfish. The social contract, which dictates that men help one another, was rewritten by the metabolic imperative, survive at any cost. When the food was gone, they turned to the grotesque pantomime of eating. They began to look at their equipment not as tools, but as potential sustenance. Leather, in the delirium of starvation, mimics the texture of meat. They sliced apart their gun belts and the straps of their packs, boiling the strips in melted snow for hours. The water turned a murky brown, smelling of tannin and old sweat, but it offered no nourishment. They chewed on the rubbery, chemical-soaked hide, their jaws working uselessly against material that was never meant to be digested. It was a placebo for the stomach, a way to trick the body into believing help had arrived, but the gut knew better. The leather sat in their bellies like stones, offering nothing but cramps and the bitter taste of processed cowhide. Then came the moccasins. They roasted the soles of their footwear over the dying embers of their fires, scraping off the charred bits and swallowing the warmed leather. Consider the desperation required to eat the very things that protect your feet from freezing. By consuming their shoes, they were effectively consuming their mobility, eating their only means of escape. It was a cycle of diminishing returns. The energy required to chew and digest the leather was likely greater than the caloric energy derived from it. They were participating in a zero-sum game against thermodynamics, and the house was winning. The smell of singed leather and unwashed bodies created a miasma of despair that hung over the camp, a scent that no wind could scrub away. The physical deterioration of the men was rapid and horrifying. Their faces lost the softness of humanity, revealing the stark geometry of the skull beneath. Eyes sank deep into their sockets, gleaming with a feverish, feral light. Their gums bled, their teeth loosened, and their skin took on the translucent, grayish pallor of wax. They moved with the jerky, agonizing slowness of marionettes with tangled strings. Every step was a negotiation with gravity. Every breath of the thin, freezing air was a battle. They stopped speaking because words cost breath, and breath was heat, and heat was life. The silence of the group was broken only by the wet, rattling coughs of men whose lungs were slowly filling with fluid. Israel Swan was the first to falter, a collapse that was as predictable as it was pathetic. He was the oldest, his metabolic fire burning lower than the younger men, his reserves depleted weeks ago. He became a ghost haunting the periphery of the group, trailing behind, stumbling, falling, and requiring the resentment-fueled assistance of the others to stand again. In a well-fed society, the elderly are accorded respect, in a starvation scenario, they are an anchor. The others looked at Swan not with pity, but with a growing, unspoken calculation. He was slowing them down. He was a caloric liability. Every time they stopped to wait for him, they burned energy standing still in the cold. The nights were the worst. They huddled together for warmth, a pile of shivering limbs and rags, but there was no comfort in the contact. The proximity only heightened their disgust for one another. They smelled the ketone breath of starvation on each other's faces, a sweet, sickly odor like rotting apples. They felt the bones of their neighbors pressing against them, a tactile reminder of their own mortality. Trust had evaporated. Sleep was not rest, it was a series of shallow, freezing naps interrupted by the fear that one might not wake up, or worse, that one might wake up to find the others staring with that peculiar, hungry intensity. Finally, the inevitable occurred. Israel Swan sat down in the snow and refused to get up. It was not a dramatic resignation, his body simply reached the terminal point of its endurance. The biological machine ceased. He died not with a prayer, but with a whimper, a small, insignificant sound that was immediately swallowed by the vast silence of the San Juan Mountains. The group gathered around him, looking down at the bundle of rags and cooling flesh. There were no tears. Grief is a luxury of the surplus economy. Here, in the deficit of the wilderness, there was only a cold, hard pragmatism. For a moment, the taboo held. The laws of God and men, drilled into them since childhood, stood like a thin glass wall between them and the body. They were Christians, civilized men of the 19th century, not savages. But civilization is a fragile construct, dependent on a steady supply of bread and beef. As they stood over Swan, the wind howling through the pines, the hunger pangs clawed at their insides with renewed ferocity. The abstraction of person began to fade, replaced by the reality of meat. Swan was no longer a companion, a father, or a friend. He was 70 kilograms of protein, fat, and bone. He was a resource that had just become available. The transition was psychological before it was physical. One of them, perhaps Packer, perhaps Bell, looked at the corpse and saw the solution to the equation. The moral repulsion remained, but it was being shouted down by the biological imperative to survive. The brain, starving for glucose, rationalized the unthinkable. Swan was dead. He could feel no pain. To leave him here to the wolves and the crows would be a waste. Was it not a greater sin to let 5 living men die when the means to save them lay at their feet? This is the insidious logic of desperation, the way the mind twists virtue into a justification for atrocity. The first cut is always the hardest. It requires a physical violation of the sanctity of the human form. Someone had to kneel in the snow, draw a knife, and treat the body of Israel Swan like a deer bagged on an autumn hunt. The sound of the blade slicing through layers of clothing, then skin, then muscle, is a sound that marks the end of humanity and the return to the animal state. The blood that spilled was dark and thick, freezing almost instantly on the snow, a shocking contrast of crimson against the white. It was not a ceremony, it was a butchery. They did not weep. They worked. The smell of raw meat, once the skin was peeled back, triggered a primal response in the survivors. It was the scent of life. Their mouths watered, a physiological betrayal of their conscience. They stripped the flesh from the bones with clumsy, shaking hands. They took the best parts first, the thighs, the buttocks, the soft tissues that promised the quickest energy. They were efficient, driven by a hunger that bypassed the higher brain functions entirely. In the freezing cold of the high Rockies, the steam rising from the warm internal organs was the most beautiful and terrible thing they had ever seen. Fire was kindled, a small, smoky affair fed by damp wood. They skewered the pieces of their former companion on sticks and held them over the flames. The smell of roasting meat drifted through the trees, a scent that would normally signal comfort and safety, but here signaled the crossing of a permanent threshold. They did not wait for it to cook through. They ate it rare, the juices running down their chins, their eyes wide and unblinking. They ate with the ferocity of wolves, tearing at the fibers, swallowing chunks whole. In that meal, the 5 survivors consumed more than just the flesh of Israel Swan. They consumed their own souls. They swallowed the line that separates man from beast. With every bite, the taboo weakened. The horror of the act was washed away by the rush of calories flooding their systems. The pain in their bellies subsided, replaced by a heavy, narcotic fullness. They looked at each other across the fire, their faces smeared with grease and soot, and saw that the judgment in each other's eyes was gone. They were accomplices now. They were bound together by a secret that was heavier than the snow piling up around them. The death of Israel Swan was the turning point. Before, they were victims of the elements, struggling to maintain their dignity. Now, they were predators. The psychological barrier had been breached, and once breached, it could not be rebuilt. They had learned that their companions were edible. They had learned that the human body is nothing more than a container of energy. As they finished the meal and cast the picked clean bones into the snow, the dynamic of the group shifted fundamentally. They were no longer walking together, they were walking with their future meals. The lottery had begun. Swan was the first course, but the winter was long, and the hunger would return. The mountains watched with indifference as the men wiped their mouths and prepared to sleep, their bellies full of their friend, their dreams infected by the taste of forbidden sustenance. The Rubicon had been crossed, and on the other side, there were no laws, only the gnawing emptiness of the stomach and the sharp edge of the knife. What transpired next on the high, wind-scoured plateau of the San Juan Mountains was not an odyssey of heroic endurance, nor was it a testament to the indomitable human spirit. It was a methodical, slow-motion dismantling of the social contract, a descent into a primal workshop where the only product manufactured was death. The narrative of survival, often painted in broad, noble strokes by those who have never missed a meal, suggests a shared struggle against the elements. But the reality of the Packer camp was far more sordid. It was not a brotherhood of suffering, it was a waiting room for the slaughterhouse, where the queue was determined not by fate, but by the sharp edge of a hatchet and the cunning of the one man holding it. The consumption of Israel swan had broken the seal. The taboo against cannibalism is a heavy psychological door, reinforced by centuries of religious and cultural conditioning. But once that door is kicked open, it does not swing shut again. It hangs off its hinges, revealing the cold, utilitarian room behind it. The remaining men, Packer, Bell, Miller, Humphrey, and Noon, were no longer companions bound by a common goal. They were competitors in a biological zero-sum game. The protein provided by Swan's emaciated frame bought them time, but time in the high Rockies is a currency that inflates rapidly. The calories burned simply by shivering in the sub-zero nights outpaced the meager sustenance they had gleaned from their friends' bones. The atmosphere in the camp shifted from desperation to a quiet, vibrating paranoia. Trust is a luxury afforded to the well-fed. In the starving, the brain rewires itself to view every other living organism as a threat or a resource. Sleep became a dangerous gamble. To close one's eyes was to offer one's jugular to the group. They watched each other across the smoky, sputtering fire, their eyes deep in their sockets, assessing the flesh on their neighbors' bones. They were no longer seeing men, they were seeing walking larders, inventory to be liquidated when the hunger pains returned with their inevitable, cramping violence. Historical reconstruction, based on the forensic evidence found later, suggests that the subsequent deaths were not the passive result of starvation. Nature is a cruel executioner, but it is rarely so efficient as to drop 4 men in quick succession while leaving one perfectly intact. The evidence speaks of acceleration. It speaks of a transition from scavenging to predation. Alfred Packer, the man who had led them into this white hell, evidently decided that waiting for natural selection to take its course was too slow a process. He began to intervene. The camp became a stage for a sequence of murders that were less about malice and more about the cold logic of the butcher shop. The specific order in which the remaining men fell is a detail lost to the silence of the mountains, obscured by Packer's shifting and contradictory confessions. However, the forensic narrative etched into their skeletons tells a story that words cannot obscure. When the spring thaw finally allowed investigators to reach the site, they did not find men curled up in the fetal position, succumbed to the gentle sleep of hypothermia. They found violence. They found skulls that had been stove in by blunt force trauma, the signature of a hatchet wielded with purpose. This was not the work of the cold does not swing an axe. Imagine the sound of that violence in the absolute silence of the wilderness. The wind in the San Juans is a constant, mournful presence, but it would have been punctuated by the wet, dull thud of metal striking bone. It likely happened when the victim was asleep, or perhaps weak from hunger, unable to raise an arm in defense. The killer did not need to be a master combatant, he only needed to be the one who stayed awake the longest, the one who possessed the will to strike when the others were drifting into the lethargy of starvation. Packer, despite his epilepsy and his questionable competence as a guide, possessed a feral vitality that the others lacked. He was the survivor not because he was the strongest, but because he was the most willing to discard his humanity. Frank Miller, the heavy-set butcher, likely went early. His bulk, once an asset, had become a target. In the twisted economy of the camp, his muscle mass represented the greatest return on investment. The sheer caloric value of a man like Miller would have been a tantalizing prospect to a starving brain. One can visualize the grim pragmatism of the act, the blow to the head, the cessation of the wheezing breath, and then the immediate, frantic work of the knife. There was no time for mourning. To mourn was to waste energy. The body had to be processed before it froze into a block of ice that would turn a knife blade. The butchery that followed was not the desperate, messy scavenging of animals. It was shockingly methodical. The remains found at the site indicated that the bodies were not merely gnawed upon, they were dressed. The chest cavities were opened, the ribs cracked back to access the heart and lungs. The large muscles of the thighs and the pectorals were stripped away in clean, long cuts. This was the work of a man who knew his way around a carcass, a man who treated his former companions with the same emotional detachment one would apply to a deer or a elk. Packer was curating his diet. He was not eating the refuse, he was selecting the prime cuts, the nutrient-dense organs and the protein-rich muscle, leaving the rest for the scavengers of the forest. James Humphrey and George Noon followed the same grim trajectory. They were reduced from human beings with histories, families, and dreams into piles of discarded bone and gristle. The campsite, a small clearing surrounded by towering pines, became a grotesque abattoir. The snow was stained with the dark, iron-rich pigment of their lives. Strips of human flesh were hung on the bushes to dry in the cold air, a jerky made of friends, preserved for the journey ahead. The smoke from the fire would have carried the scent of roasting meat, a smell that is indistinguishable from pork to the uninitiated nose, but which must have smelled like damnation to anyone with a soul left intact. The final confrontation, according to Packer's later testimony, was with Shannon Bell. Packer would claim self-defense, painting Bell as a raving madman who had snapped and come at him with a hatchet. It is a convenient story, the classic defense of the sole survivor who writes the history because there are no other witnesses to contradict him. But the physical evidence casts a long shadow of doubt over this version of events. Bell's skull, like the others, bore the marks of catastrophic trauma. Was it a duel to the death between the last two men, or was it simply the final stroke of the axe against the last remaining competitor? In the end, it matters little. The result was the same, Bell ended up in the pot, and Packer ended up with his wallet. The isolation of the plateau acted as a magnifying glass for the horror. There were no police, no judges, no neighbors to hear the screams. The trees stood as silent witnesses, indifferent to the violation of natural law occurring at their roots. The sky remained a brilliant, uncaring blue by day and a crushing, starry void by night. In this vacuum of civilization, the rules of the game had reverted to the Pleistocene era. The strongest, or the most treacherous, eats the weakest. Packer proved to be the apex predator in this closed ecosystem, not because he had claws or fangs, but because he had a hatchet and the capacity to use it on his own species. As the weeks dragged on, a transformation took place in Alfred Packer. The starving wretch who had stumbled into the mountains began to fill out. The protein and fat of his 5 companions were metabolized, repairing his own wasting tissues. His cheeks regained their color. His belly, once concave and aching, grew distended and then firm with layers of new fat. He was literally building a new body out of the bodies of the men he had led to their deaths. He wore their clothes to layer against the cold. He counted their money to pass the time. He was absorbing them entirely, a singular entity becoming a collective of ghosts wrapped in a stolen coat. The cruelty of the situation lay in the physiological success of the crime. Cannibalism worked. It provided the energy necessary to keep the internal furnace burning. It fueled the brain, allowing Packer to think, to plan, and to eventually walk out of the mountains. If he had clung to the moral high ground, he would be just another pile of bleached bones on the Slumgullion Pass. By discarding the high ground and descending into the muck of biological necessity, he ensured his survival. It is a bitter pill for the moralist to swallow. The bad man survived because he did the bad thing, while the good men died because they hesitated, or simply because they turned their backs at the wrong moment. Packer did not just eat to survive, the evidence suggests he ate to thrive. He discarded the less desirable parts of the bodies, the hands, the feet, the heads, tossing them into a shallow ravine or leaving them scattered around the campsite. He was picky. He had the luxury of choice. This selectivity is perhaps the most damning detail of all. It implies a degree of comfort, a surplus of supply that allowed him to reject the gristle in favor of the tenderloin. He was living in a horrific abundance, a king of the mountain with a court of corpses. The wind eventually buried the evidence under fresh layers of snow. The blood turned black and was covered by the pristine white. The bones were gnawed by coyotes and foxes, who finished what Packer had started, scattering the remains further. But the stain remained. The campsite on the plateau was no longer just a patch of ground, it was a crime scene where the victim was humanity itself. Packer had proven that under the right pressure, a human being is nothing more than 70 kilograms of meat capable of thinking, right up until the moment it becomes dinner. When Packer finally prepared to leave the camp, he was not crawling on his hands and knees. He was fueled by the lives of 5 men. He packed his kit, which now included the wallets and personal effects of the deceased, a final act of acquisition. He wrapped strips of the remaining meat in cloth for the road, a travel snack derived from the thigh of a man who had once trusted him. He turned his back on the carnage, on the shattered skulls and the scattered ribs, and began his descent toward civilization. He was walking proof that the line between man and monster is not a wall, but a line drawn in the snow, easily crossed and easily covered up by the next storm. The mountains let him go, perhaps because they recognized him as one of their own, cold, indifferent, and consumptive. He walked down toward the valleys, a well-fed ghoul ready to rejoin the society of men, carrying the weight of his friends in his stomach and their gold in his pockets. The arrival of Alfred Packer at the Los Pinos Indian Agency in mid-April of 1874 was not the return of a prodigal son, nor was it the miraculous salvation of a lost soul. It was, to the observant eye, a biological discrepancy that bordered on the obscene. When a man walks out of the frozen wilderness after 2 months of alleged starvation, the expectations of the frontier are grimly specific. One expects a skeleton wrapped in parchment skin, a creature that moves with the brittle fragility of a stick insect, eyes haunted by the proximity of the void. One expects a man who has been hollowed out by the cold, his body having consumed its own muscle mass in a desperate bid to keep the heart pumping. But Packer did not crawl out of the mountains, he strolled. He descended from the high country with the casual air of a tourist returning from a brisk, invigorating hike, his vitality an insult to the physics of survival. He pushed open the doors of the agency mess hall not with the trembling hand of the dying, but with the firm grip of the entitled. The heat of the room, smelling of wood smoke, stale tobacco, and unwashed wool, washed over him, but it did not seem to shock his system. His face, which should have been a gaunt mask of suffering, was flushed with a healthy, almost manic color. His cheeks were round and full, boasting a layer of subcutaneous fat that no diet of roots and rosehips could possibly sustain. His beard was matted, yes, and his clothes were stiff with grease and grime, but the man beneath the filth was suspiciously substantial. He moved with a spring in his step, an elasticity of muscle that suggested he had been well fed while the rest of the territory had been tightening its belt against the winter famine. The first request he made to the men at the agency was not for a priest, a doctor, or a loaf of bread. It was for whiskey. This demand, delivered with a grin that revealed teeth in surprisingly good condition, set the tone for the entire macabre theater that was about to unfold. He threw coin onto the counter, silver that chimed with a heavy, distinct sound against the wood. The men in the room, hardened veterans of the West who knew the look of disaster, stared at him with a mixture of confusion and dawning revulsion. A starving man asks for water, a desperate man asks for food. A man who has just eaten a hearty meal and wishes to celebrate his good fortune asks for liquor. Packer was behaving like a miner who had struck a vein, not a guide who had lost his entire party to the snow. As the whiskey began to flow, so did the stories. And here lies the true pathology of Alfred Packer. He was a liar who lacked the memory to sustain his own fabrications. With the first glass, he claimed that he had been abandoned by his companions, left behind because of his sore feet while they marched ahead to find food. It was a tale of victimization, painting him as the martyr of the group, the cripple left to die by heartless men. He described their departure with weeping eyes, a performance that might have been convincing had he not looked so incredibly well nourished. He spoke of subsisting on roots and gum from the pine trees, a diet that results in scurvy and emaciation, neither of which were evident on his person. By the third glass, the narrative began to shift like sand in a windstorm. Now, the story was that the group had scattered in a blizzard, lost to the whiteout, while he alone had stumbled upon a sheltered valley with small game. The details blurred. The timelines contradicted themselves. He spoke of the dates of their separation with a vagueness that did not align with the calendar. But the men listening, General Charles Adams, the agency clerk, and the rough-hewn laborers, were not listening to the words as much as they were watching the men. They saw the way his eyes darted around the room, assessing the reaction, calibrating his lies in real time. They saw a man who was frantically trying to construct a reality that would cover the dark, greasy truth sitting heavy in his stomach. But the most damning evidence was not in his words, it was in his pockets. As Packer grew more intoxicated, his caution evaporated, and he began to flaunt the spoils of his survival. He pulled out a wallet, then another, then a third. These were not the meager coin purses of a destitute drifter. They were the leather wallets of the men he had led into the mountains. He opened them on the bar, revealing rolls of banknotes and drafts. He produced a pipe that did not belong to him. He toyed with a skinning knife that bore the initials of Frank Miller. He was a walking pawnshop of the dead, a museum of the men who had vanished. This was the moment where the horror truly crystallized for the onlookers. It was not just that Packer had survived, it was that he had profited. He had committed a total absorption of his companions. He had consumed their flesh to fuel his body, and he had consumed their wealth to fuel his future. In the harsh, transactional logic of the Wild West, this was the ultimate capitalist coup. He had converted 5 human beings into calories and cash. He stood there, buying rounds for the house with money that belonged to the men he had digested, laughing at jokes that weren't funny, a parasite that had successfully swallowed the host and was now wearing its skin as a suit of armor. The agency personnel, men like Dolan and Adams, were not naive. They had seen death in all its forms, frozen, shot, starved, and diseased. They knew that a man who walks out of the San Juan Mountains in April after losing his supplies in February does not carry a surplus of body weight. They looked at Packer's waistline and did the mental arithmetic. Conservation of mass and energy is a law that cannot be broken. If he had not eaten food from a store, and he had not eaten game, then he had eaten something else. The realization rippled through the room not as a shout, but as a cold, heavy silence that settled in the corners. They were drinking with a ghoul. Packer, oblivious or perhaps simply arrogant, continued his display. He offered to sell a horse that he claimed to have found, a horse that matched the description of one owned by Israel Swan. He tried to sell a rifle that was known to belong to Shannon Bell. He was liquidating the assets of the expedition right there in the agency, treating the possessions of the dead as if they were a rightful inheritance. It was a grotesque display of ownership. He did not seem to understand that these objects were not just commodities, they were evidence. To him, they were simply the perks of being the last man standing, the bonus payment for the hard work of butchery. The atmosphere in the room grew thick with suspicion. The Ute Indians who hung around the agency, men who knew the mountains better than any white surveyor, watched Packer with a stoic, knowing gaze. They saw the meat sweat on his brow, the peculiar odor that clings to a man who has consumed too much flesh. They knew the look of a predator that has fed well. To them, Packer was a Wendigo, a creature of appetite that had violated the fundamental laws of nature. They did not need a confession, they only needed to look at his rosy complexion to know that he had feasted on forbidden fruit. Packer's behavior became increasingly erratic as the days passed. He stayed at the agency, sleeping in a warm bed, eating 3 meals a day, yet he never seemed to lose the voracious appetite of the starving. He ate with a frantic, guarding intensity, shielding his plate with his arm as if expecting someone to steal his ration. It was a muscle memory from the camp, a leftover reflex from the days when he had to defend his cut of human meat from the prying eyes of the wolves and the ravens. He complained about the quality of the government beef, stating with a disturbing lack of self-awareness that it lacked the sweetness of the meat he had found in the mountains. He spent the dead men's money with a cavalier disregard for its source. He bought new clothes, discarding the rags that were stiff with the fluids of the slaughter. He bought tobacco, playing cards, and more whiskey. He was trying to wash away the memory of the plateau with the comforts of civilization, but the stain was indelible. Every dollar he spent was a testament to a life cut short. He was literally spending the life savings of the men whose bones were currently being picked clean by coyotes 10,000 feet above. It was an economic obscenity, a transfer of wealth that required the murder of the investors. The lies continued to mutate. When pressed by General Adams about the specific route they had taken, Packer's descriptions were gibberish. He spoke of peaks that didn't exist and rivers that flowed uphill. He claimed to have walked distances that were physically impossible in the deep snow. He was trying to obscure the location of the bodies, trying to draw a map that led nowhere. But he was a clumsy architect of deceit. His lies were transparent, born of a mind that was cunning but not intelligent. He thought that because he was the only witness, he owned the truth. He did not realize that the truth has a way of surfacing, especially when it is buried in shallow graves. The psychological state of Alfred Packer during this time is a subject of dark fascination. He did not exhibit guilt in the traditional sense. There was no weeping, no confession of sin. Instead, there was a strange, hollow pragmatism. He seemed to believe that he had done what was necessary, and therefore, he was absolved. He viewed his survival as a validation of his actions. If God or nature had wanted him to die, he would have died. The fact that he was standing there, drinking whiskey and spending stolen money, was proof of his righteousness. He was the fittest, and the fittest do not apologize to the dead, they digest them. People began to avoid him. The air around him felt colder, charged with a static electricity of unease. When he walked into a room, conversations died. Men would instinctively check their own wallets, a subconscious reaction to the presence of a predator. Packer was a reminder of the fragility of their own existence. He was the mirror image of their worst fears, the realization that if the snow gets deep enough and the hunger gets bad enough, any one of them might turn into a meal. He was the monster in the plain sight, wearing a new hat and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. By the end of April, the net was tightening. The discrepancies in his stories were too glaring to ignore. The sheer volume of cash he possessed was impossible to explain away. And then, the strips of dried meat he still carried in his pack were discovered, strips that looked suspiciously unlike venison or elk. The agency men whispered in the corridors. Plans were made to retrace his steps. Packer, sensing the shift in the wind, began to look for an exit, but he was trapped by his own greed. He couldn't leave the comfort of the agency, the steady supply of food and liquor. He was tethered to civilization by his appetites, unaware that the very society he sought to rejoin was preparing to put him in a cage. He sat at the bar, a bloated tick on the hide of the West, finishing his drink and ordering another, paying for it with a bill that still bore the bloody thumbprint of a friend. The final act of the Alfred Packer saga is soaked in the bile of the American judicial system, a mechanism that proved to be as erratic and clumsy as the hatchet blows on the Slumgullion Plateau. Justice in the Wild West was never about righteousness, it was about administrative theater and the re-establishment of order in a land that constantly threatened to dissolve into chaos. When the snow finally melted in the late spring of 1874, the mountains surrendered their secrets with the indifference of a melting glacier. The bodies were found, not as sleeping saints, but as butchered livestock, their bones scattered and their skulls shattered. The evidence was not merely forensic, it was a screaming indictment of the biological shortcut Packer had taken. Yet, the path from the crime scene to the grave was not a straight line of retribution. It was a winding, bureaucratic farce that exposed the moral vacuum at the heart of the frontier. Packer was not immediately crushed by the wheels of the law. In true parasitic fashion, he fled. He escaped custody with the ease of a man who knows that incompetence is the most common trait among jailers. For 9 years, the Colorado cannibal ceased to exist, replaced by a nondescript drifter named John Schwartz. He lived in Wyoming, hiding in plain sight, a wolf wearing the wool of a sheep. He worked, he ate, he breathed, and he likely slept soundly, untroubled by the ghosts of the men he had digested. This decade of freedom is perhaps the greatest insult to his victims. While their bones bleached in the high-altitude sun, Packer was enjoying the simple pleasures of a borrowed life, his belly full, his neck unstretched by the hangman's rope. It proved that the universe possesses no inherent karmic scale, it only possesses geography, and if you move far enough west, you can outrun your own sins. When the law finally caught up with him in 1883, it was not due to divine intervention, but due to the mundane gossip of a former associate who recognized his laugh in a saloon. He was dragged back to Lake City, a mining town that treated his arrival not as a solemn legal proceeding, but as the premiere of a grotesque circus. The trial was a spectacle of Victorian hypocrisy. The courtroom was packed with miners, prospectors, and whores, all eager to catch a glimpse of the monster. They did not look at him with horror, they looked at him with the voyeuristic thrill of people who want to see what a man looks like after he has crossed the ultimate taboo. The air in the room was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and chewing tobacco, a fitting atmosphere for a case involving the consumption of human flesh. The presiding judge, Melville Gerry, has been immortalized in Western folklore, though likely for words he never actually spoke. The legend, delicious in its cynicism, claims that upon sentencing Packer, the judge fell into a partisan rage. The story goes that he slammed his gavel and roared that there were only 7 Democrats in the entire county of Hinsdale, and Packer, that voracious son of a bitch, had eaten 5 of them. While historical records suggest a more somber and biblically infused sentencing speech, the durability of the Democratic meat legend speaks volumes about the era. It reduces the tragedy of 5 murdered men to a punchline about local demographics. It suggests that the true crime was not the cannibalism but the reduction of the voter base. In the collective memory of the West, political affiliation held as much weight as the sanctity of life. Packer was initially sentenced to death. The date was set, the gallows were prepared, and the community anticipated the satisfying snap of a neck. But the legal system, in its infinite complexity, faltered. Through a series of technicalities and appeals involving the timing of the crime relative to statehood laws, the death sentence was overturned. The rope was put away. The monster would not swing. Instead, he was retried and sentenced to 40 years in prison, 8 years for each man he had consumed. It was a mathematical compromise, a way of quantifying the value of a human life in terms of time served. 8 years for a life. It was a bargain. In the economic calculation of the frontier, a man's existence was worth less than a decade of state-sponsored lodging. He was shipped to the Cannon City Penitentiary, a stone fortress designed to break the spirit of the unruly. But Alfred Packer was not unruly. He was adaptable. He had survived the winter in the San Juans by eating his friends. He would survive prison by becoming a model inmate. The man who had cracked the skulls of his companions with a hatchet became a gardener. He grew flowers. He wove hair ropes and sold them to curious visitors who wanted a souvenir touched by the hands of a man-eater. The irony was thick enough to choke on. The public, initially repulsed, began to view him with a strange, morbid affection. He ceased to be a threat and became a curiosity, a tiger behind glass, safe to look at and easy to pity. During his incarceration, the narrative around Packer shifted. He found an unlikely champion in Polly Pry, a sensationalist journalist for the Denver Post who saw in Packer not a killer, but a headline. She painted him as a victim of circumstance, a senile old man persecuted by a vindictive legal system. The fact that he had admitted to eating the men was glossed over. The focus shifted to his suffering behind bars. It was a masterclass in media manipulation. The public, possessing the memory span of a goldfish, began to forget the details of the butchery. They forgot the strips of flesh hanging on the bushes. They forgot the stolen wallets. They saw only a sad old man with a white beard, and their capacity for outrage was replaced by a sentimental desire for redemption. In 1901, the final act of absurdity played out. Alfred Packer was paroled. He had served less than 2 decades for the slaughter and consumption of 5 human beings. He walked out of the prison gates, not into a hail of bullets from vengeful relatives, but into the sunshine of a new century. The governor of Colorado, bowing to public pressure and the relentless campaigning of Polly Pry, signed the papers that released the wolf back into the flock. Packer was free. He had outlived his victims, he had outlived the outrage, and he had outlived the judge who sentenced him. He had digested them all. His post-prison life was a surreal epilogue to a nightmare. He settled in Littleton, a quiet community on the edge of Denver. He did not hide in a cave. He lived in a house. He became a familiar sight on the streets, a monster on pension. The neighbors knew who he was. They knew that the hands waving hello had once butchered Frank Miller and cooked the thighs of Israel Swan. Yet, they tolerated him. He became a local mascot, a dark celebrity. Children would come to his porch, and he would tell them sanitized stories of the mountains and give them candy. Consider the image, the mouth that had chewed on human gristle now offering peppermint to the grandchildren of the pioneers. It is a tableau that perfectly encapsulates the amoral flexibility of the American West. Packer lived for 6 more years, a peaceful, uneventful twilight for a man of such violent appetites. He worked briefly as a guard at a newspaper office, a job secured by his journalist friends, but mostly he just existed. He was a living relic, a biological artifact from a time when the rules of civilization had not yet hardened. He was a testament to the fact that consequences are often optional. He had committed the ultimate taboo, violated the most sacred laws of nature and God, and his punishment was a comfortable retirement in the suburbs. He walked the streets of Littleton not as a pariah, but as a man who had simply done what was necessary to survive, and in the harsh light of the 20th century, survival was the only virtue that mattered. In the end, it was not the hangman or the vigilante's bullet that claimed Alfred Packer. It was the slow, indifferent decay of his own biology. He died in April of 1907, 33 years after he walked out of the snow with a belly full of his friends. The cause of death was listed as senility, trouble and worry, a euphemism for a brain that had finally decided to shut down. Legend says he died screaming, haunted by the spirits of the men he ate, but the reality was likely far more mundane. He probably died quietly, his mind eroded by dementia, forgetting the taste of the meat, forgetting the names of the men, forgetting the cold wind of the plateau. He slipped away into the dark, leaving behind a legacy that refuses to rot. The burial of Alfred Packer was the final insult to the concept of justice. He was laid to rest in the Littleton Cemetery, with a proper headstone and a veteran's military funeral, courtesy of a brief, fabricated stint in the army years before the cannibalism. He lies there today, under a slab of concrete rumored to be placed there to keep his corpse from rising, or perhaps to keep the curious from digging him up. He rests in peace, while the scattered bones of Bell, Humphrey, Miller, Noon, and Swan were left to rot in the wilderness for decades before receiving a pauper's reburial. The predator got the marble monument, the prey got the dirt. The moral of the Alfred Packer story is that there is no moral. To look for a lesson in justice or karma here is to misunderstand the nature of the Wild West. The frontier was not a place where good triumphed over evil. It was a place where biology triumphed over ideology. Packer proved that a human being is nothing more than a container of calories, and that society's rules are flimsy paper walls that burn the moment the temperature drops below freezing. He showed us that the greatest sin in nature is not eating your neighbor, but failing to survive. Packer was a liar, a thief, a murderer, and a cannibal. But he was also a winner. He beat the odds. He beat the elements. He beat the legal system. He consumed the lives of 5 men to extend his own, and he did it with a ruthless efficiency that, in a darker light, looks almost like the purest form of capitalism. He absorbed their capital, both financial and organic, and used it to purchase 33 years of life. We may loathe him, we may recoil at the details of his feast, but we cannot deny the cold, hard fact of his success. He walked out of the mountains when better men died. He is the dark mirror of the American dream, the self-made man who made himself out of the parts of others. And as he lies in his grave in Littleton, one can almost hear the faint, cynical laughter of a man who knows that in the end, history does not judge the hungry, it only judges the dead. The stomach has no conscience, and neither, it seems, does history.